Some of you, I really want to thank Mark and Jennifer and James for inviting me here. Some of you may not know that, I know that you know that Mark was a graduate student at University of Ottawa. While he was there, in addition to completing his thesis, a very well-written, beautiful thesis, he also spent his time running the only place to get decent food on campus, which was the graduate student cafe called Nostalgica. And I remember that Mark wrote this great piece that I loved. He was way back then he was thinking about the commercialization of universities because University of Ottawa had an exclusive contract with Coca-Cola that allowed them only to sell Coca-Cola products and not Pepsi products or anything else on campus. And so Mark wrote this great article in the student newspaper called "Why the University Has Forced Me to Be a Coke Pusher." And it got a lot of attention. It was really, it was great. So that was a golden time in the graduate student organization at University of Ottawa because Mark and his colleagues were super amazing. It then entered a kind of regressive time, but it's now back to a little bit better. I had a brief phone conversation yesterday with my friend Gordon Lafer, who works at the University of Oregon's Labor and Education Research Center, and he's also a colleague and friend, and it reminded me of this time I had asked him for advice. Some of you may know that 15 years ago I was fired from New York University when the graduate students who were not unionized were seeking to form a union. I was asked to, well, knowing that I was a supporter, they asked me if I would testify before the National Labor Relations Board of the United States on their behalf. And you know, I thought about it, and I consulted with a few people, and then just to be sure, at the end, I picked up the phone and called my friend Gordon. And I said, should I testify? And Gordon said that I had, a stellar record of publication. I had won teaching awards. I was well-liked by colleagues and had years of positive reviews on my way to tenure. He thought it would be no problem at all. And so, trusting Gordon, I testified. You can read about the federal court case that ensued, if you want, by doing a web search for Westheimer and tenure denied. The New York Times, under the headline, "New York University Denied Tenure to Union Backer," reported that the US government's National Labor Relations Board charged New York University with illegally denying tenure to a professor who had testified in favor of allowing graduate students to unionize. That's a quote from the New York Times. The Chronicle of Higher Education headline read, "A promising professor backs a union drive and is rejected for tenure." And smaller papers and magazines made similar observations. Now, of course, as you can imagine, I was more concerned at the time with wanting my job back than with thinking about the broader implications. The cacophony of negative publicity heaped on NYU was a kind of just desserts, to be sure. But thrust into the public position as I was did raise one particular concern for my scholarly interests at the time, then and now, in democratic education. Nearly every news story cast my lot as an isolated incident of vengeful retribution by a few university administrators, rather than as a case of something much larger than one professor, me, or one university, NYU. Now, for the past 13 years, I've been happily employed at the University of Ottawa, and I'm pleased to report that my children have not gone hungry. But whether others view my earlier dismissal as scandalous or justified, I find the following irrefutable. The forces that set the process in motion and enabled it to continue are an inevitable byproduct of dramatic changes that the academy has been facing in the past several decades. These changes have little to do with individual university employees and much to do with changes in the structures and workings of the academy itself. Not only NYU, but also private and public universities across the United States and Canada. The truth that in part we are all here to discuss today, as Ivana Lincoln made so horrifyingly clear yesterday and other speakers have followed up, in particular Michelle Fine just this morning, is this. Universities, whether because of a cultural shift or out of a perverse quest for survival, now increasingly model themselves after corporations seeking to maximize profit, growth, and marketability. And as a result, the democratic mission of the university as a public good has all but vanished. And many of the ideals of academic life, academic freedom in my case, but also intellectual freedom, intellectual independence, collective projects, and pursuit of the common good, have been circumscribed or taken off the table altogether on a growing number of colleges and university campuses across North America. I want to title my comments today, Fictive Austerity. Not because I think universities do not have financial problems, and I've had the pleasure of talking with Robert and a few other university presidents and administrators here, but because I feel strongly about the need for academics and administrators alike to challenge the inevitability of those problems, those financial problems. So I'm hoping you don't mind if I begin with a few recollections from the Occupy Wall Street movement and its relationship to so-called austerity measures. After that, I'll offer a few reflections on what's been happening in K-12 education and why we in higher education should be worried. And I'll conclude with two related issues in higher education reform. You know, on this link, and Michelle did this as well, this link between K-12 education and higher education, I sometimes feel like, is this weird? I get shorter and taller. Is that going to be okay? I sometimes feel like I'm one of those characters from a dystopic sci-fi novel where I come back from the future and warn everyone, because what's happening in K-12 education is just coming on its way to higher ed, and what's happening in the United States, where I'm from, is on its way to Canada. So I feel like one of those characters saying, don't go there, I've seen the future and it's awful, it's horrible, don't go. And so that's, I'm going to be making those links. Now, so first, Occupy. You may remember that back to the summer of 2011, when the Vancouver-based magazine Adbusters proposed a peaceful occupation of Wall Street to protest the ever-increasing corporate influence on the world's democratic institutions and processes. On September 17, 2011, that occupation began with a few hundred people gathering first in Battery Park in New York City, and then moving to the now infamous Zuccotti Park, where they formed an encampment. By October 15th, global demonstrations had reached 950 cities in 82 countries. In Madrid, the Occupy protests attracted more than 500,000 protesters, 500,000. But the claims of insignificance began immediately following the September 17th gathering. Things like they have no agenda, they have no leaders, they have no goals, they lack political affiliation, they're a bunch of hippies, they're drug users, they're disorganized, they lack organizational skills, they're misinformed, they're bitter, and these critiques are the ones we still hear to this day. These criticisms and claims of insignificance and inefficacy are all around us. But Politico reporter Dylan Byers showed a remarkable transformation that few understood, but that everyone experienced. It's a transformation that should especially grab the attention of those of us who traffic in words and ideas for a living. Byers conducted a Nexus Lexis search and found that the media's use of the term income inequality surged by more than 500% from 91 instances in the week before the OWS protests began to more than 500 instances in November of 2011. In other words, income inequality had become part of the national and global discourse in a way that it hadn't been in decades. In other words, Occupy Wall Street may go down in history, if for nothing else, for the critically important task of making economic justice part of the conversation. The terms 1% and 99% are burned into our vocabulary as an important shorthand for a discourse on justice that had previously been confined to only one part of the political spectrum. Now, there are as many illustrations of what the gap between the 1% and the 99 as there are Starbucks in Manhattan, but let me cite just one popular one. The 5 wealthiest individuals in the world have a net worth of $260.5 billion. I think that units of billions of dollars have become so commonplace in our collective .com imagination that we've lost the true meaning of them. But $260 billion equals the combined GDP of 84 of the planet's approximately 195 nations. Okay? In other words, 5 individuals control the same amount of wealth as 84 of the 195 nations on the planet. The idea, unfair, right. The idea of Occupy Wall Street was born here in Canada in the Vancouver offices of Adbuster, but the implications reach much farther. right? As is now common knowledge, the 1% owns a radically disproportionate share of society's resources. And by the way, we all know, many of us hear the statistics about the US constantly. Income inequality in Canada is growing faster than it is in the US, partly because it was less unequal before, but partly because neoliberal policies have taken hold in Canada in an entrenched way. Just to give you, there's so many statistics, of course, but Canada's richest 10% now owns 58% of national wealth, while the bottom 50% owns 3%. In the US, the highest 1% of income earners now controls approximately 40% of the nation's wealth and almost half of all investment capital. 43% of Americans are liquid assets poor, meaning they lack the money to live for 3 months if their main source of income were lost. So what does so-called austerity mean against this backdrop? Who should be austere exactly? Since we're in Canada, I'll use Canada as an example, and I'll even zero in on Ontario where I live. But of course, these lessons apply to the United States for sure and elsewhere. As James mentioned, I'm the education columnist for CBC Radio's Ottawa Morning and Ontario Today shows, and a number of times already, they've asked me what from education should be cut in this time of austerity. I want to know who declared this a time of austerity. It's like we start from that question, in this time of austerity. Everything starts in this time of austerity, comma. Who declared this time of austerity? In Ontario, the savings called for in education are often cited in millions of dollars. Sometimes policymakers talk in hundreds of thousands. Oh my gosh, we have to cut funding for a student assistance center that costs $87,000 per year to run. But who designated education and other public services like health as the unique target for society's savings? Currently, stock options are taxed at half the rate that Canadians pay on employment income. Corporate tax rate in Ontario will drop to 25% this year. The group Doctors for Fair Taxation, calling for an increased taxes on the wealthiest Canadians, for example, an additional 6% tax on those who make more than $1.8 million, this would raise an extra $5 billion nationally. Ontario alone would raise $1.7 billion. Echoing Warren Buffett's moving plea to Americans, this group, the Canadian Doctors for Fair Taxation's motto is, tax us, Canada's worth it. Here's one more statistic, and then I promise I'll almost stop with the statistics. Restoring a 14% provincial corporate tax would recoup $2 billion annually. Restoring the corporate capital tax just for banks and adding 2 percentage points of tax on personal income over $500,000 would collect a further $1.2 billion annually. Is this a time of austerity for Canada or for the United States? At the same time that 40 million Americans were uninsured before Obama's new health plan, ExxonMobil's 2011 profits rose 35% to $41.1 billion. That's nearly $5 million in profit every hour, or more than $1,300 every second. Exxon pays a lower effective tax rate than most Americans and refuses to pay $92 million in the cleanup costs for the Exxon Valdez Alaskan oil spill. But it had no problem paying one individual, the CEO Rex Tillerson, $29 million 2 years ago in salary and bonuses. These are, as political economist Gary Alperovitz observes, medieval numbers. So nobody should be asking educators at any level about what universities should be cutting in this time of austerity. These inane questions from the media and from politicians and policymakers about so-called times of austerity that always begin with, what programs of immense public importance and benefit should be cut, should instead begin with, how should our public revenue systems be adjusted in this time of radically medieval economic injustice? More than 60 years ago, former US Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis is purported to have warned that, quote, we can have democracy or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. If he was right, then democracy today is in grave danger. Now, what does all this have to do with education and with us educators? Put simply, I think that this massive allocation of national and global resources away from the provision of public goods and towards what we have begun to uncritically call the free market economy is a matter of concern for any educator at any level of the system. The importance of the Occupy movement from the perspective of educators derives from its tremendous success, though incomplete, in highlighting the discourse that presents a challenge to the air we breathe, acceptance of capitalism for the poor, socialism for the rich reality in which we now find ourselves. I am not an expert in higher education policy. I'm a professor of education, and I feel like in some ways, well, actually, I'm going to skip that part for time. But I am a professor of education, really. We need only look at places like Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Nevada, Nebraska, or here in Canada, Ontario, for example, in the form of last year's Bill 115, which was breathlessly swept in by a liberal government, no less, to see the kind of policy frameworks and machinery that are being motivated in the pursuit of the full destruction of the common good, or the commons, as the opening speaker mentioned. Things like Ontario's Bill 115, which attempted to strip teachers of their collective bargaining rights, was a shot across the bow of public sector employees generally, but I think it's especially significant for educators. Some of you probably remember this kind of cute and poignant question that was circulating the internet a few years ago during the hedge fund crisis. It said something like this: do you remember when teachers, public employees, Planned Parenthood, NPR, and PBS crashed the stock market, wiped out half of our pensions, took trillions in TARP money, gave themselves billions in bonuses, and paid no taxes? Yeah, me neither. So let me get back to the dystopic future I was talking about. I want to make 3 points about the corporatization of education. First, despite the success of Occupy Wall Street in placing inequality squarely in the national conversation, in education reform circles, this notion of inequality has been hijacked by the neoliberal proponents of all testing, all the time curriculum to mean a gap in test scores only. Right? That's what inequality is, the beginning and the end. Second, because schools and universities shun controversial topics, inequality is most often talked about in terms that are politically safe but educationally facile. Students learn to experience politics as a kind of spectator sport. And finally, the impact of this increasingly corporatized campus on critical thinking is something I'll comment on at the very end. So I'm just going to go through these 3 briefly, and then I'd love to open it up for discussion. So testing first. Many of you are exceedingly familiar with the many critiques of a test-based curriculum, things like its enforced uniformity, its bias, its relegation of all but math and literacy to the margins of the school experience. And I, of course, support all of these critiques, but I'm most concerned about this. As much as the Occupy Wall Street movement has opened up a space for discourse on inequality, the testing, accountability, and standards onslaught has co-opted that space for its own purposes, to advance further testing and ultimately inequality in schooling. And as Michelle Fine pointed out, to acquire school buildings, schools, sell them off to the highest bidder or to private corporations that run them, and ultimately to turn them into condos, as Michelle noted. Many teachers would echo the sentiments of Gloria, a teacher in a recent study I conducted of the grade 10 civics curriculum in Ontario. She told us this. This is Gloria speaking. In my 22 years of teaching, never have I experienced a climate that has turned all educational problems into problems of measurement until now. Poor citizenship skills raise their math and literacy scores. Poor participation doesn't matter. Poverty, inequality, the solution is always to give the students more tests. These days, pedagogically, I feel like I can't breathe. Right? And we have quote after quote from teachers like that who just feel that their pedagogy and their teaching is being constrained by this myopic focus on testing in only math and literacy. Some of you may have heard me use this example before, certainly Jen in our School and Society class, but it just so captures the current moment that we're in that I love it. I was looking a couple years ago at the website of the Ottawa School Breakfast Program. Is there a Regina School Breakfast Program? program? There probably is. Many of you have school breakfast programs in your cities. So I was looking at the Ottawa one here. I'm going to get shorter again. On the website, there's a Q&A. And the Q&A, the first question on it was, why is the Ottawa School Breakfast Program important? Now, mind you, school breakfast programs are fantastic. The Ottawa one feeds 8,000 kids breakfast every morning who would otherwise go through the day hungry. And there's wonderful people who work there. I know many of them, and I work with them. But the first question on the Q&A was, why is the school breakfast program important? And here's the answer. Children who arrive at school hungry do not perform well in the classroom. Numerous studies have shown that students who are fed are more alert, develop greater self-esteem, have better attendance, and fewer discipline problems. Children who receive a healthy, nutritious head start to the day show a marked improvement in academic achievement. God, it wouldn't be enough to feed them because they were hungry, right? I mean, these are hungry children coming to school. I mean, I can't think of any more basic moral imperative that we hold up than feeding hungry children. But we have to put it in terms of metrics, the metricization of everything, and we have to say that the reason we're feeding them is because it's going to raise scores on standardized tests in two subject areas, in math and literacy. And I also am concerned, because you might have heard in that quote, it said, studies show, right? This is like the evidence thing. And I wonder, as a social scientist, I'm kind of wondering, who's the control group in these studies? Are they starving children and putting them in a room? Of course they don't do as well on the tests. They're starving, for God's sake, right? And so this example is so extreme, but it shows where we are as a society where everything needs to be metricized, everything needs to be tied to some kind of numerical value, abdicating our social responsibility to think of what's important without a number staring us in the face, right? Do we need numbers to tell us that feeding hungry children is an important thing? I don't know. It's of course not the Ottawa School Breakfast Program people. They're wonderful people. They know what they have to do to attract funding, and this is the terms they have to put in. So do arts teachers. Arts is now, embraced once again in schools here and there where it can, because some studies have shown that participation in the arts raises kids' performance on standardized test scores. Or you remember way back some years, the Mozart thing, the mothers strapping tape recorders to their... You remember that, right? Not because it's really nice to listen to Mozart, but because some study showed that if you play Mozart to a baby in a womb, 12 years later, they're going to do better on their math tests or something. And so everything, right? Everything is metricized in that way. Ultimately, I think that so hunger and all these other things are fair game to be co-opted by education reformers concerned exclusively with raising test scores on these standardized measures of academic achievement. And ultimately, many of us go along with this because even though parents do not like all the testing, and teachers do not like all the testing, and kids do not like all the testing, the discourse on inequality has been trumped by the discourse on quantification of outcomes. In other words, we're unable to measure the things we care about, so we start caring about the things that we can measure. So that's it on the testing part. My second point was that because schools shun controversial topics, inequality is most often talked about in terms that are politically safe but educationally facile. Some of you may know the work of Diana Hess on controversial issues discussions and how they're often shunned in schools, but we all go by this phrase of keeping politics out of the school, right? We should keep politics out of the school. I often argue that we need to bring politics back into the school. In Bernard Crick's famous classic work in Defense of Politics, he argued that politics is a great and civilizing activity. It's the way that people in democratic societies come together to work out their differences and move forward with social policy, right? And kids, of course, need practice working with those kinds of issues of politics and debate and controversy. But increasingly, that's been pushed out of the schools. In my studies as well on classroom behavior, before and after Occupy, teachers and even professors were afraid to raise questions about the fairness or injustice of free market ideology and its alternatives for fear of incurring objections from students, parents, peers, or legislators. A lot of teachers told us things like, we can only take it too far because the powers that be will object. And remarkably, we found this to be the case for some professors who felt that there were topics that they shouldn't talk about in their classrooms around inequality and other issues because it might be too controversial and scare away students or customers or get parents irate. One said, my department head told me that we could discuss economic inequality, but not whether taxes are fair because it would be too controversial and too political. Right? Now, I want to be clear that the experiences of these teachers and professors do not represent the totality of what is taught to children and young adults. The reality is, there's lots of controversy left in classrooms, and there's certainly lots left in university classrooms. But this kind of myopic curricular focus that we see in K-12 education, and that may be coming soon to a university near you, comes from this increased emphasis on measurability, metrics, and a kind of corporatized climate where the outcomes need to be able to be placed in the context of measurement and so forth. I'll give one example just of the way that controversy has been pushed out of classrooms in K-12 because it's one of my favorites. Florida, I think, became the first US state to simply outlaw critical thinking altogether. In 2006, the Florida Omnibus Education Act, which is this like 3,000-page document, had this beautiful little, it guides curricular practice and what's going to be taught in the schools. It had this little gem in it. It said, the history of the United States shall be taught as genuine history. American history shall be viewed as factual, not as constructed, shall be viewed as knowable, teachable, and testable, not open to interpretation. Historians, of course, chuckled at all this, right? Because, I mean, what else is history but interpretation? The law also went on to require educators to stress the importance of free enterprise to the US economy. Legislation in Kansas requires teachers to teach, quote, the superiority of the free enterprise system over other systems. And an Arizona state bill bars teaching practices that, quote, overtly encourage dissent from American values without specifying exactly what dissent from American values means. This is the new corporate education in K-12 education. And it's been coupled with massive efforts to deprofessionalize teaching, tying pay and evaluation to student test scores, close or reconstitute more schools, attack teachers' unions, and teaching as a profession. And standardized tests, value-added merit-based pay schemes, it's all coming to universities which have moved from a mission of public knowledge and citizenship to a mission of job training and profitable patents. I think this discourse is more aggressive in the US, but it's certainly, as we heard from other speakers, present here in Canada. Which brings me to my final point, which is the impact of the corporate campus on critical thinking. Let me read you a quotation from the mission statement. How's my time? Anyone give me a time check? Lots of time. Oh, that's great. So here's my final point, and then we'll open it for discussion. It's the impact of the corporate campus on critical thinking. I'm going to read this quotation from the University of Toronto. Within the unique university context, the most crucial of all human rights are meaningless unless they entail the right to raise deeply disturbing questions and provocative challenges to the cherished beliefs of society at large and of the university itself. It is this human right to radical, critical teaching and research with which the university has a duty, above all, to be concerned. For there is no one else, no other institution, and no other office in our modern liberal democracy which is the custodian of this most precious and vulnerable right of the liberated human spirit. Isn't that beautiful? It's very nice, and it's part of the U of T mission statement. It might be hailed as a kind of shining example of the centrality of university campuses in promoting and preserving critical thinking as the engine of progress in any democratic society, except for one thing. Institutional leaders at the university who drafted those words do not believe them and do not abide by them. The University of Toronto is the site of two of the most notoriously blatant violations of these principles in the past decade. The well-publicized cases of Nancy Olivieri and David Healy involving the university's unwillingness to stand up to corporate funders and protect academic freedom and the integrity of critical inquiry. Unfortunately, the Olivieri and Healy cases do not stand alone. Scores of examples of scientific and social science social scientific research essential to public welfare are undermined by private influence. In fact, more than 52% of funding for clinical medical research is now from corporate sources. The trend is easiest to spot and most publicly alarming in the medical sciences, since lives are at stake. But there is cause for concern as well in the humanities and social sciences, where publication of inconvenient truths can be discouraged by university higher-ups. The harm to the reputation of the university as a reliable source of especially scientific information untainted by private conflicts of interest has been documented extensively. But the ways these changes affect the campus life of faculty and students has been considered far less. As universities turn to business models, becoming certification factories rather than institutions of higher learning, democratic educational ideals are fast becoming obsolete. Courses not directly related to job training look more and more like useless dust to be eliminated. Meetings among faculty about which program of courses might yield the most robust understanding of a field of study and of the debates and struggles that field entails are rapidly being replaced by brainstorming sessions about how to narrow the curriculum to fit into, for example, 2 weekends in order to incentivize matriculation and increase student enrollment. Now, there's another aspect of this that I want to mention, which is the corporate benefits of what I call the meritocracy myth, and others have called it that too. One final characteristic of this newly corporate campus I want to address is the complicity of the professorial and graduate student culture. The pervasive culture of increasing individualism results in a story we tell ourselves that goes something like this. We work in a merit-based system. If I do my job correctly, if I'm a good graduate student or a good professor and I'm smart and I do my work well, I will be rewarded with a plum teaching assignment, and I will be part of the academic elite and get a job. This is an unfortunate state of affairs for 2 reasons. The first is economic and concerns the entrenched system of academic labor. The simple reality is that for the majority of disciplines, the claim that the system is merit-based is just not true. There are vastly more qualified, hardworking individuals than there are tenure-track and tenured academic positions for them to fill. At a certain level of proficiency, it becomes the luck of the draw. But the second cost of an emphasis on individualism in the form of the meritocracy myth might be more insidious. Faculty focused only on individualized measures of professional success miss out on the collective action that has an extensive history in democratic societies and that has sustained and driven countless scholars, artists, scientists, and activists working together towards a common goal. Merit-based rewards encourages faculty to work behind office doors, estranged from colleagues. As my colleague Mark Bousquet points out in his book, How the University Works, believing in the fantasy of merit results in a great loss to everyone, including those dubbed meritorious. The corporate university, on the other hand, advances and benefits from the illusion that each of us will attain rock star status in the academy. Some readers might recall the episode of the television show West Wing when fictional President Jeb Bartlett explains why Americans seem to vote against their own interests by protecting a tax system that benefits only the super rich. He says, it doesn't matter if most voters don't benefit, he explains. They all believe that someday they will. That's the problem with the American dream. It makes everyone concerned for the day they're going to be rich, right? The problem with the meritocracy myth in the university is that it makes everyone concerned for the day they are going to be dubbed meritorious and an academic superstar. And so it goes for this star system in the academy. The more graduate students and professors believe that their hopes for professional satisfaction lies in superstar recognition for their individual work rather than in collective meaning-making and action, the easier it is for democratic life in the university to be compromised. If universities hope to strengthen democratic society and foster critical imagination, we must resist focusing curriculum and research on skills training, workforce preparation, and the commercialization of knowledge to the benefit of private industry. We must instead participate in the rebuilding of a public purpose for education. So in summary, I want to close by just revisiting what I said at the outset. The beauty of the Occupy movement is that it has made possible a kind of conversation that has the potential to open up the currently constricted and myopic focus in school reform on only the narrowest and most emaciated of educational goals, those subject areas that can be measured by test scores. We have Occupy Wall Street, but this has always been in part about inequality and in part about democratic principles more broadly. That is, the language of Occupy is the language of participation and the language of the anti-corporatization of universities. It's the language of an unfulfilled dream of political efficacy and education for the common good for all. It's a promise, I think, that people count. It's an unfulfilled promise, but it's a promise nonetheless. Thank you. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we've got a good 8 minutes.
8 minutes, look at that. Yeah. Paul, I don't know, ask them.
Thank you, Joel. Learned a lot, as I always do from you. Just talking about the hungry kids, and we'll feed them to raise test scores rather than the moral issue of them being hungry. We actually, my colleague Mike Cottrell and I have done a lot of work in Finland, and so we've brought some students there last year, and in Finland they pay a lot of taxes. This is almost taken on the whole neoliberal agenda here that Finland generally does. I mean, they have to be a little wary of neoliberalism, of course, but they feed all their kids a healthy lunch. Doesn't matter their income of the parents at home. They don't have any private schools. They do no standardized testing except the PISAs, where they do very well. And you know this, I know, but some people may not. They also do the opposite of what we do here, which is deregulate the private and regulate the public. There they do it the other way around. They don't feel that they need to do teacher accountability. So it's quite interesting that teachers have high status in Finland, don't feel that fear that we've been talking about here. I'm not sure about in higher ed, but I think it's the same thing there. They don't have the same pressures as we have here. It's quite interesting, a country that can kind of withstand neoliberal forces or the corporate takeover of society, have all these other benefits like feeding all their kids in a healthy way, and having teachers that aren't working in fear but working to make it a better society. I don't know what the magic is in the Nordic countries, but there's something going on, and particularly in Finland, right? I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, only this, Paul, it was a nice summary, and it's amazing because Finland has been the little darling child of so many of the conservative education reformers who say, look at Finland, they're scoring #1 on PISA, so that's why our education system is failing. And then they go on to say, so that's why we need to have standardized testing, teacher testing, reduce teacher pay, and blah, blah, blah. Everything that is the exact opposite of what Finland does, right? And so to me, it's a good example, and I'm glad you brought it up, of the way that this kind of discourse on corporatized education sort of runs roughshod, just flattens all the actual conversations. So when we talk about evidence-based decision-making, which that discourse loves so much, it's not only that evidence-based decision-making is problematic, which it is, but it's also that it's not evidence-based decision-making, right? It's ideologically based decision-making. There's no reverence for evidence whatsoever, and we know that here right now with Harper in power. So it's a very good example of that. And also, you said that Finland scored #1 on the PISA scores. They were also very careful to say that we don't care what we score on the PISA scores. Next year we might be number 10, just like the universities rise and fall in the Maclean's rankings or whatever it is. That's not our goal. Our goal is something different. Unfortunately, in talking with Pasi Sahlberg this summer, as you have too, I know, Paul, I've heard that Finland is also starting to dismantle some of the beauty that they've built around
it. It is starting to encroach. Yeah. You could do that time travel that you were talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It wouldn't be a talk if Len didn't ask a question, right?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Joel. I have one suggestion, and the suggestion is that rather than say fictive austerity, in which it becomes very much a truth-falsehood kind of lens through which we think, that the notion should be fabricated austerity. Because fabrication puts emphasis on labor, on investment, on resources. It takes a lot of money to generate impose and police a lucrative lie. So the fabrication is really very important. And this was borne out spectacularly at the University of Saskatchewan, of course. The University of Saskatchewan, which went from feast to famine to feast again, invoking austerity in the movement to invoke Robert C. Dickinson, bring in the trial by templates, put the matricians to work, and put the fear of death into the whole faculty and the support staff. And what was really interesting in the mobilization of a fabricated austerity was that when President McKinnon stepped down, everything was supposed to be in excellent shape. Almost the day his successor, Eileen Bush-Vishniak, came in, there was a projected $45 million deficit over 3 years. The moronic recommendations of Dickinson were used. Faculty were recruited to punish themselves, to establish hierarchies, to communities of the deserving and those who deserved to disappear. All of that was in place. So that it was, but there were tremendous administrative resources put into concocting, circulating, and securing consent for this fabricated fiction.
Yeah.
And it's turning round, but the good part of this is, of course, when they were called by the faculty and they won on every day, it seemed that they had completely triumphed. But it was a moment of supreme administrative hubris, followed by catastrophic administrative stupidity. Of course, and what happened? The provost fell on his integrated planner and took one for the team. The president was fired. The chair of the board of governors retired. And suddenly the whole of the team, the senior leaders team, has gone in an extraordinary purge.
Yeah.
So it all came from student resistance, faculty resistance, the ability to document how much resources went into the fabrication of the fiction, and the resolve that that fiction would not prevail over faculty knowledge.
Yeah. Thank you, Len. That was really, really nicely said. I've taught at 3 universities, Stanford, NYU, and University of Ottawa, and I was a visiting prof at University of Toronto. And in all of them, I've sat in meetings where it does sometimes seem like administrators forget that faculty members are researchers, right? You can't just put data up that people aren't going to look into, and so I appreciate your saying that, but I want to say a couple of things. One is that I think we sometimes make the mistake of pretending the war is between faculty and administration, right? Both have different agendas. Some of those agendas are more legitimate than other agendas. But of course, the real war is taking place. That would be convenient for the powers that be if the war is played out only between administrators and faculty. The truth is that administrators are put into this bizarre position where they have to be branding the university if they're going to get students to go there, and their provincial and national and federal funding is being cut, and blah blah blah, and on, right? I think we have to redirect the war against the broader issue which Naomi Klein articulates so well in Shock Doctrine, which is just a fabulous book if you haven't read it, which is what enables administrators to say, oh, this is a time of austerity. Now, I don't mean that there aren't ill-meaning or let's say at best moronic people who, yes, one year we have a $30 million surplus and the next year it's magically turned into a $50 million deficit. These numbers are just thrown around. But my main point, and I was really glad you brought that up in the way you did, Len, is that this isn't about austerity, it's about choices. Right? It's about choices of where we put our resources as a society. And until we broaden the conversation into the broadest possible meaning of those choices, in other words, how are resources allocated? I hope that this came through in my talk, is that the reason I talked so much about inequality is because that's where I think this all lies, right? It's about the choices we make as a society to how we allocate our resources. And if we allocate our resources to education in a way that is substantive and meaningful, then we wouldn't be in these embattled positions that we are.
Last Well, this is not a question. I was going to tweet this, but then I figured I'd use the old-fashioned Twitter. And I think it's really useful to put the ideas that you're raising about Occupy into conversation with what Indigenous scholars, especially Sandy Grande, has written a gorgeous paper, and Joanne Barker has done some really elegant work about the problems of Occupy and occupation as being the action or the social justice format. So Sandy's paper is called Accumulation of the Primitive, something like Limits of Liberalism and Occupy Wall Street, and it comes out of 2013. But what does it mean to, as a form of justice, occupy stolen land, occupy land that others are already claiming? So I just wanted to make that connection, but also intervention on how we're...
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I'd like to think more about it. I mean, my initial reaction is it's two different metaphors of the same word, obviously, occupation of land and occupation of an ideology or Wall Street hegemony seem different to me, but I'm very interested in...
Well, I think that what the invitation, what actually the urgency is to link those.
I see, right.
Because what is it to talk about inequality on stolen land without talking about the stolen land?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Do we have time for Michael? Last one.
I do have a question, Joel, but maybe I'll save the question for a conversation we can have with a group of us. It's a pedagogical one. I want to pay you a compliment, and I hope it doesn't sound fawning or glib, but no one can nor should ever accuse you of just standing on a soapbox, because you are constantly grounding your actions and your work in the life world. I just like how you moved from there to there all the time. I'll just leave it at that.
And you say that even as I stepped on the box there. Yes. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael, for that comment. Please join me in thanking you all.